again, everybody. Lance Russell and Dave Brown right along ringside. By golly, we're about ready to go with more big action.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'm Gordon Solie, your host, and we have quite an hour in store for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Championship Wrestling at ringside. This is Vince McMahon, along with wrestling's only living legend, Bruno Sammartino.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mid-South Wrestling Television. I'm your host, Boyd Pierce, another outstanding card.
Hey, guys, and welcome back to the Regional Rasslin Podcast, where we talk the territories. I am Ray Russell, and this week, as I said last week, new year, new projects, guys, and we're going to do it again right here one more time. Last week, it was 1977 Memphis territory, Steve Crawford. Now we're going to break in to the end of an era, talking about the old LeBell Los Angeles territory. Going to take a look at the last couple years there. What went wrong? We're going to talk about the highs and the lows and everything in between. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to bring on our special guest for this very project, Los Angeles in the early 80s. Here he is, the one and only Mr. Too Hot to Handle, Drummond, Vandal. He is a.k.a. better known as Kurt Brown.
Greetings. It is good to be with you. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this since I actually started the Regional Rasslin Podcast. You know, one of the original ideas I had was the end days of Los Angeles territory, 81, 82. It was on my poll. Of course, the WWF won that first poll. And then we've been doing Georgia and the UWF and Memphis. But it's time to finally give the West Coast some love, Vandal.
I feel very honored that you have picked me to talk about this era. I was there for so much of it. I was one of these cats who's always a little late to the party because I discovered pro wrestling in Los Angeles not quite a year after the famous Freddie Blassie, John Tolos feud. So I was totally ignorant to that brilliant angle for several years. And by the time I was old enough to go to the matches and get involved with wrestling, that was when the L.A. promotions run by Mike LeBell was nosediving into obscurity. It was both kind of sad, but also wildly amusing, and also a lot of fun at times too.
Yeah, it was wildly amusing is an excellent description of it for sure. There's lots going on here. I can't wait to get into the early 80s, 1980 through 82, and look at all the talent that was there and what you remember. And you got to hobnob with a lot of these guys by that point in time in the early 80s.
Yes, the first wrestlers that I became friends with was in 1981. I had just moved back home from Eugene, Oregon after living there for a year. And I met wrestler Diamond Tim Flowers, Bad Boy Bobby Lane, who is some people on social media might recognize. He is the little brother of Marie Laverne, the uncle of Steve Nelson, and his parents were Bobby Pico and Ann Laverne. Gordon Nelson was his brother-in-law.
Wow. Okay.
And that same summer, I met Dr. Jerry Graham, and my life changed forever.
Well, we have definitely heard some Jerry Graham stories over on the 605. You've told quite a few of them, and man, what they don't have a word for Jerry Graham, do they? There's really no adjective to describe Jerry Graham.
No, the best way I can describe him was it's a weird mix of a very gritty Raymond Chandler character and a silent movie character in a comedy.
Right.
I mean, if I could tell you the number of times I saw him, two sheets to the wind, going through a full book of matches, trying to light his cigarette, and the match going out right when it got to the tip of the cigarette. It was like a regular occurrence.
That is an old-timey type. I could see a silent film with that. That would be the entire story. Just Jerry Graham would make it work for certain.
Totally.
And people often ask, why was that Vince McMahon? They always talk about Vince Jr., Vincent Kennedy. That was his favorite wrestler growing up. He wanted to be like Jerry Graham. He rode in the car with Jerry Graham, and we've heard the other stories about Jerry. And, it's goofy, and not talking about some of the underhanded things that Vince has done, but just the goofiness of some of the things that he's done as well.
Yes.
You can kind of see why he loved Jerry Graham so very much. It's his fault, pal.
Absolutely. I've met other characters in wrestling, but he was unique. He was unlike anyone Yeah, I never take offense if I bring up his name and somebody like has a kind of nauseous expression on their face saying I couldn't stand that guy. I understand totally, but I liked him.
He was an acquired taste, is
people,
what you're trying to say.
Oh,
well,
yeah, exactly.
As long as he did no harm to me, I could see myself digging that dude for sure. But
I had a good time. I tell people the secret to having a friendship with him for so many years was I would share all my secrets with him except for two: my home address and my telephone number.
But I love it.
Yeah, I saw, and it's true. I saw what happened to people who said, "Oh, come over anytime, Jerry."
Oh,
it was a mistake.
Yeah, I could see that happening. Yeah, absolutely. So you got to hang out and start getting into the business yourself, and we'll talk about that as we continue on as well. But I want to go back. I want to take you way back. You said you missed the entire Blassie Tolis feud. You come right out. It's like missing the entire Monday Night War or something along those lines back in the day. It's like, man, you just missed out on the NWO and Stone Cold and The Rock and all this stuff. And so we go back to the territory you grew up on. I did not know you spent a year in Oregon. So in 1980 to 81, you might have gotten to see a little of the Don Owen stuff there as well, huh?
It was amazing. Yeah. That whole year, I never went to a show in Portland at the same Portland Sports Arena. I went to the Eugene Fairgrounds, Lane County Fairgrounds. And at that time, they had an arena that seated maybe about 2,000 people. About 2 years later, Elton Owen, who was Don Owen's unusual brother, I guess, wanted to cut costs, so he changed it to a location on the fairgrounds that seated like 300 people. It was very strange.
You know, when you cut costs and you shrink the arena, you're also shrinking the amount of people that can actually attend the show. Somebody should have told Elton that.
Yeah, exactly. And they would fill that place. You know, there were times like when they, Buddy Rose and Jay Youngblood, when I was there, had a really long feud. If I remember correctly, I think it went like for 5 or 6 months.
Oh, wow.
And the longer they feuded, the more that place filled up. That was a really good experience, just getting to see. Buddy Rose is probably going to be known best for the blow-away diet and his comical antics on WWE, but seeing him every week, that guy was a master main event heel.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's no doubt.
He was like an orchestra conductor. He knew how to bring the crowd up to a crazy heat, but then you had to, break that tension before they got dangerous. He was something to behold every week, even if the other matches weren't very good. And usually they were pretty okay, except for the openers.
Most of the people were coming to see Buddy get his butt kicked. Exactly.
And he delivered every time. Before he had his substance abuse issues, he was a workhorse.
Yeah. So I didn't know that. And I didn't want to get off topic to everybody out there waiting to listen about LA, but I didn't know your background in regards to Portland. So I had to ask that question up front because I'm wanting to introduce you to the WrestleCopia fans. I know a lot of people already know you from the Super podcast and various other podcasts that you've done, but now, I'm expanding my horizons and bringing you on board the Regional Rasslin podcast, and I'm just looking forward to really breaking down LA. But before the decline, there was a lot of peaks along the way there in the 1970s. You got to enjoy a ton of talent that went through there. Even if you missed Blassie and Tolis, you got a whole lot more to follow. And I was going to ask you, do you remember your earliest memories? Maybe not just the guys involved, but do you remember like the earliest angles or the earliest stars that you really backed or something that really stuck out to you?
Oh, yes. I remember the very first time I turned it on. I love the way I entered, the way my fascination with wrestling took place, because I had no concept of what pro wrestling was. I had none. I knew what, college, Olympic wrestling was.
Right.
But my family wasn't really a sports-oriented family, so I didn't know much about football, a little bit about baseball, not much, though. One night, a friend is staying the night, and we're just old school channel surfing, where you go up and actually click the channels.
Oh, yeah.
And I turn to channel 13, and I see this action taking place in a TV studio, and I saw a heel who named Fritz von Goring, who just passed away about a month or two ago. And he is just beating the crap out of Salvador Losario. Mm. And so I see these grown men in spandex, just raking each other's eyes, kicking each other, and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. Grown-ups acting like kids, essentially. And I'm saying, this stuff is awesome. Like, hey, John, look at this fighting here. Like, look at this. What is this? And my friend says, what is that? That's wrestling. And I sit there going, wrestling? What? It was so far from what I thought of as wrestling.
Right.
But I immediately became infatuated with it. And I found it a really wonderful time. When I look at the history of the territories, I really love when I started watching it, because when we got to watch it twice a week. Saturday nights, live from the KCOP Channel 13 TV studio. And then Wednesday nights on the Spanish station, they did TV, a separate batch of TV tapings there live from the Olympic Auditorium. So I think sometimes the KCOP shows were tape delay from earlier in the day, but a lot of the action we saw was live. And the TV studio tapings, we had as far as the hosts, we had the holy trinity of broadcasters. We had Jimmy Lennon doing the ring introductions, even in the TV studio.
Oh, wow. Really? In the TV studio? I didn't know that.
Yes. When I saw other promotions, or even later LeBell in the last year when Jimmy Lennon wasn't involved, I'm just saying, wow, I didn't realize what a treasure we had in having Jimmy Lennon every week at the KCOP Channel 13 studios. Yeah. Then we had Dick Lane, who old school movie buffs, especially people who followed the RKO scene, will know that Dick Lane was a longtime a studio player at RKO Studios. Probably his most famous role. They were all supporting roles. I don't think he ever had a starring role, but he was the circus owner in Bringing It Baby, who's going to have the leopard put down. And I mean, he's my all-time favorite commentator. We could argue whether he, Lance Russell, or Gordon Solie was the best. He's always my pick, and part of that is just my sentiment. But he was great. He would just get you enthused with the action. He had this firecracker of a voice and just this happy-go-lucky enthusiasm to him. And then Gene LeBell was the fellow who would do the locker room interviews after the matches, interviewing the wrestlers. And that was the perfect formula. And I didn't realize how special that was until about a year and a half later, when Dick Lane walked out on the promotion because they wouldn't, give him a pay raise. Mike LeBell was notorious for trying to pinch every penny he could. Okay, well, I've
heard of promoters like that in the past. That's unfortunate too, because just the little bit that exists of Dick Lane, he was one of the best of all time. You talk about all the catchphrases throughout, wrestling history of those announcers. There's a malfunction in the junction. Katie bar the door, and of course Dick Lane's
Whoa, Nelly.
That's it. Whoa, Nelly. Dick Lane. I love it.
Yes. Yeah. No, he is somebody that's one of my eccentricities. Is I like to look and just find any movie I can find that has Dick Lane in it. And he's one of my side research projects. I'll just every now and then see what's can I find out about this guy. He was a very fascinating cat. His story was a really interesting one.
Well, that's
I mean, he was a big part of not just wrestling, but the birth of television in Los Angeles. He was a huge part of KTLA Channel 5 when they first were on the air. He hosted a number of different shows, and
right. And I think he took a different approach to pro wrestling than a lot of the announcers from the era prior, where they were trying to make jokes and things of that nature. Sometimes you would hear them. They weren't necessarily wrestling announcers. They were they worked for the local TV studios, or, doing the voiceover, whatever. They were sent to the arenas. And so a lot of them were just going to business for themselves, whereas Dick Lane treated it like a real sport, I guess you could say, to a degree, and he took it seriously. And I think that's why he was so successful and remembered so fondly, because he treated pro wrestling, with respect, I guess you could say.
Yes, he treated it with respect. He could be a bit campy and that kind of thing, but it wasn't like those hosts say, where you could almost picture them rolling their eyes as they were narrating.
Right.
Where he would act like he was sincerely upset when a heel did something, really awful. And he was perfect for it. When Gene LeBell took over commentating, that's when you realized what a treasure it was having Dick Lane there, because Gene LeBell, there were some weeks he was okay, but most of the time he sounded like he was at a job he didn't want to attend.
Right. He was kind of forced into that position with Dick Lane gone. That's really unfortunate too, when you found a piece like that and you lose it over some money. Now, if he walked in and asked for $1 million, I get it. We can't do that. However, I'm sure that he was asking for a fair raise. I wasn't there. I don't know, but I have heard stories about Mike LeBell, like you said, pinching a penny here and there. So that's really unfortunate for you guys. So tell me about the Spanish side of things. You said they would air matches straight from the Olympic Auditorium, tape from there. Now, was it the same way we would see it, some of the tape, the footage that's out there from the later 70s from the Spanish-speaking channel? Yes. I didn't know if they changed the way they aired it over time, or if it was all basically the same throughout the 1970s.
It more or less stayed the same. Okay. Maybe the time, the length. I can't remember if they changed how long the shows were at some point, but when I first started watching, it was a 90-minute show. Both shows were 90 minutes long. Wow. And the Spanish shows had a great duo of commentators, a fellow by the name of Miguel Alonso, who did a lot of sports announcing, and Luis Magana, who, I should kick myself. I don't know nearly as much about Luis Magana as I should, but he was a guy, I think he was involved in the boxing scene too. But he's another guy like Miguel Alonso, was a solid character here in the L.A. territory, not just the wrestling territory, but media territory. My dad, you could count on him watching whenever the Spanish show was on, because one of my dad's hobbies was the only other language he became fluent in was Italian, but he was a fan of just listening to other languages and trying to follow them. And he just loved Miguel Alonso, especially when the 3 count would happen, when Red Shoes Dugan would leap over the wrestlers, who were in the pinning position, and he would do the 3 count. Miguel Alonso would yell, "Un, dos, tres, palmadas," which means 1, 2, 3 palm counts. And my dad just dug that.
Oh, it's good. You talked about Luis Magana, and he had been, I believe, with the company since Cal and Eileen Eaton opened it up. So he was there basically for the entire duration. And Miguel Alonso, anybody who grew up maybe in my era, the 80s, even into the early 90s, Alonso actually even did some voiceover work, Spanish announcing for the WWF on their Spanish channel. We had the Telemundo, and I would watch Superstars on the American version, and then I would watch Superstars, the Spanish version, later in the same day. And I would do that not to see the same matches again, but because they had their own insert interviews, right, with Alonso. And, the boys would have a lot more fun with him than they would with Mean Gene, or the event center with Sean Mooney and things of that nature. So it was always a good time. And that's how I got to know him pretty well, because he would translate whatever they were saying, and then he would talk to them in English. So I got to know him as, not just some Spanish announce guy, but, he actually spoke to me. I understood him because he spoke English just like he did Spanish.
Yes, exactly. And, even on the Spanish show on Wednesday nights, it was accessible to everybody. You didn't have to speak Spanish to get what was going on.
Oh, yeah.
That's also kind of the way wrestling was, back in the day. Today it's a lot more focusing on interviews. You got to follow what people are saying. But back then, there were a lot of interviews, but a lot of the story was told in the ring.
Yeah, what a bad break for these Spanish-speaking fans. They didn't have their own television studio, so, they had to settle for, Olympic auditorium matches. That's all.
Exactly.
So you got to love that.
I did. It was a wonder. Southern California was a great place to be a wrestling fan back then, because the other treat is, if you were a child of television like I was, much to my parents' chagrin, by the time I was 10, all my siblings were so much older than myself that they had all moved out and gone to college. And so here I was by myself at 10 years old. So the television was quite, was my buddy, my best friend. And so I was always clicking through different channels, and wrestling would just pop up in the oddest places, especially on the UHF stations. What aired at the same time as KCOP wrestling on Saturday nights was Argentina's Titanes in El Ring.
Wow.
And I remember turning it on. The first time I turned it on, I remember seeing Pepino the Clown dancing to toward the ring,
right,
with the big bouquet of balloons. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, this is blowing my mind. And
there's another wrestling out there.
Like, exactly. And this was so, like, different.
Yeah.
At first I was all offended. I thought they were trying to make fun of wrestling. I thought it was like a satirical show.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I would, I was always curious, so I'd turn it on, go back from channel 13 to channel 22 to see the difference of the wrestling. When I saw, La Momia, the Mummy,
oh, yeah,
and all the different way out characters, I didn't know what a hallucination was at the time, but I was watching one. It was addicting, that show.
So you saw La Momia so long ago. You must have been ready when the monster arrived in the early 80s. Can't wait to get to that,
Oh, yes. That's a story. That's a fascinating story, too.
It's going to be a fun time, I'm sure.
Yeah, and Argentina wrestling, and again, I was really lucky because what they aired in 1972 and 73 that made its way to L.A. here, it was their high point. I mean, that promotion was around for over 28 years. Had TV the whole time. And 1972-73 was both financially and critically its greatest year ever.
Oh, perfect.
It was,
right place, right time.
Huge.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh, exactly. I didn't realize until like 20 years later that it wasn't just like a wrestling success. It was a mainstream media success. There was a magazine, I think it's called La Gente. It was, kind of a cross between Time magazine and People magazine, but they had La Momia be, what was the award they gave it? Like the pop culture phenomenon of the year.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, it was really popular. And
I thought you were going to say world's sexiest man, but okay, I was close.
Well, they did have a photo shoot where a model who I guess was popular for a short time in Argentina is fawning all over La Momia on the beach, and part of the great success of that is the promoter who ran it, who was also the world champion, Martin Cardigan. He never made any kayfabe claims. He just said, "Yes, this is just fiction. This is fun. This is for the kids," and it was huge.
Okay, so there was no kayfabe. Not that you really could have one when aliens are coming down and people are turning into plants and things of that nature. So I was just curious how all of that worked. But man, I wish a lot more footage of that was out there. There's some, but there's just not nearly enough.
Yeah, the best season, 72-73, about the only footage that exists of that is, you can probably find it pretty easily. It's on YouTube, the Titanes in the Ring movie from 1973. They show some matches from Luna Park, and they show the most famous of the Martin Cardigan versus La Momia matches. I would love if that season somehow sprang up.
Wouldn't that be something?
That would be great. The tapes that made it here into L.A. were definitely bootleg tapes.
Right.
They were,
and that would happen. I mean, that would continue to happen.
Oh, totally. Wrestling's famous for it. And it also aired for quite a long time in New York, for a while in Florida. Some of the veteran wrestling fans might remember a super fan named Fred Hornby, who was a very nice guy. But when I wrote, along with Steve Sims, the story on Martin Cardigan for the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame in 2008, I remember Fred Hornby, who was like a very traditional fan, but he wrote me and said, like, "Oh man, I enjoyed this piece so much. I loved watching Titanes in El Ring when it aired here in New York, and especially because it was the only wrestling my wife would watch. She wanted to see what was going to happen to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza the next week."
Tell her to read
we also
the
got
book.
All Japan Women in 77.
Oh, wow.
It was a candy store. You just had to...
Yeah, talk about a hodgepodge, man. You got to witness, long before the VHS, the trading days, the tape trading days, you got to witness a lot of different styles way before a lot of other people had that opportunity, it sounds like to me.
Oh, I definitely feel lucky to have been a fan in that era.
You were a student of the game at that point. You didn't even realize it yet, I bet.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just somebody who was addicted to wrestling. And yeah.
Yeah, that's how it started with me. Anything and everything I could watch. I didn't, I wasn't prejudiced against any type of wrestling, whether it was Sports Entertainment Pal or the slobber knocker stuff over there, the Bill Watts or anything like it. Whatever was on, I was tuned in. So that was the way it was for me in the 1980s. And it evolved for me for there, but I kind of wish I could go back and see some of this, in real time back in the 70s, because there was just so much going on. Sounds to me like in the Los Angeles. So it's like you said, you just had to flip the channels and hope something popped up. And God bless the old UHF stations. You never knew what was going to come in there.
Oh, they were the best. And, I don't hold out high hopes that we'll find the old Titanes tapings or the old Channel 13 tapings. But I hold out a little hope just because it's fun to think maybe there's something out there.
Well, the fact that you said it was bootlegged into places, you never know who might have it somewhere.
Yeah, if they found the George Hackenschmidt match after all this time.
Yeah.
I
never know.
I don't know that they'll find Titanes or KCOP tapings, but we do know that you can always expect to find something that people thought was lost. I mean, peruse YouTube enough, and you're just going to find things that weren't there a few months ago.
Yeah.
That's one of the wonderful things about this internet age.
Well, let's go back to L.A. for a little bit here. Let's take a look back at the old Hollywood Rasslin, the Los Angeles territory. The LeBells, of course, they take over from Eileen Eaton, who basically liked to sit at home and let them do the work, and she'd collect the paychecks once upon a time. That's how I understand it worked anyway. I don't know if you've heard anything different.
Yeah, as I understand it, she was a lot more hands-on with her boxing promotion.
Okay.
I don't know how true that is or if that's, hype, but I think she was a lot more present, front and center. Yeah, Gene LeBell becoming a commentator. Things took another change in 1975 when Channel 13, the wrestling got yanked from the channel. Yeah. And I think Rock Rims covers that in his book on Southern California wrestling, which if anybody can get their hands, I think it's out of print right now, but can get your hands on a copy. That's an excellent book as far as the history of Southern California wrestling.
Yeah, I can't recommend that book enough.
Oh, I know. It's a treasure. And I'm very glad, he wrote it, because nobody's ever done such a thorough history of Southern California wrestling.
Right.
There's been a lot of territories covered, and SoCal is not one of them, and I'm too lazy to write a book like that. but
we're going to do it here in verbal form to a degree for a couple of years anyway.
Exactly. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking with it. Yeah.
So they take the TV from KCOP.
KCOP?
Yeah.
Yeah, KCOP. Yeah, I never thought of it as KCOP. How funny. Well, what happened? Yeah, they took away the TV. From what I understand, they weren't supposed to do anything that can come off as an advertisement, except for the allotted slots where you're hyping this Friday night's matches.
Okay.
And from what Jeff Walton said, I think it was Greg Valentine was hyping a match with Jack Briscoe coming this Friday, and somebody notified. Okay, I'm getting really old because I can't remember what the TV outfit is who you call when they're breaking all the rules and shit like that.
FCC? Is that right? No, maybe that's, I don't know.
FCC. It's so easy. It's so easy. I'm getting so old and so dizzy. And I remember the last couple of years I've been doing just some research on my own, and Eileen Eaton tried to play hardball with them and pretty much was beating her chest and saying, if they take away the wrestling, we won't stick around with them for our boxing, because boxing was on the same channel on Thursday nights.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And Channel 13's KCOP just said, okay, nice knowing ya. And that was the end of the LeBell's family's association with Channel 13.
And they never got TV again in that market, American English-speaking TV, correct?
They got English, but it was UHF. Station called Channel 52. And again, it was Gene LeBell doing the commentating. It was from the Olympic Auditorium, and it just didn't have that pizzazz. I mean, wrestling was still drawing. It was it was after the KCOP era when Chavo Guerrero and his brothers came onto the scene. Mm-hmm. But that was, in my view, while the Guerrero and Piper feud was a big deal in 76, 77 and kept the territory healthy, as far as turning on the television and wanting to watch the show from start to finish, I think around 1975 was the last good year when you had a lot of good tag teams like the Hollywood Blondes, the Gordman Goliath, the Infernos. There was a lot of really just solid talent, solid angles.
Tell me something you remember, angle, match, anything you recall involving Gordman and Goliath. Because, again, that's a team that's not talked about nearly enough in the history of wrestling as one of the greatest of all time. And I think, that's unfair, because there's not a lot of footage out there of them during their peak years. And I know you're a big fan of them. I know Dave Meltzer's a huge fan, specifically of Black Gordman, but as the tag team as a whole as well. And I was curious, do you remember anything specifically that sticks out to you, a specific feud or an angle you saw on TV that really got you with those guys?
So many. I mean, I remember when I started watching, Gordman and Goliath they were somewhere else at the time. But there's one night Gordman came in just for one shot on Channel 13. And I kind of understood the heel babyface thing, but not to a large degree. And at that time, I just thought he was the coolest looking guy. I mean, he had this thick head of curly black hair.
Yeah.
And just had this son of a bitch face. Good looking guy, but just had this angry face all the time. And that first sighting I saw of Black Gordman, the first match I saw, I thought, okay, this guy's great. I hope he comes back. Well, he came back, I think, about 3 months later, and it was with Goliath. And they were battling, I believe it was Raul Mata and might have been Eric Froelich. Okay, but that's when I saw Gordman and Goliath just unleash their reign of terror, and I couldn't believe I ever liked that guy. I was so livid at his tactics. And what was, this would not go over today, but one of their key gimmicks is when they would get in the ring, Jimmy Lennon would be introducing them and say, and, hailing from Mexico City, and they would just kind of look at him, shake their heads like, and he'd say, oh, I'm sorry, claiming to be from New Mexico.
There it is.
And that would get wild heat from the Latino fans.
Right.
One of the things unique about them as a tag team is they weren't like a Road Warrior tag teams where you see two guys who kind of look so similar to each other in build and that sort of thing. They wore the same wrestling outfits, the same tights, the black and red tights. But Gordon was this this loudmouth individual who was always shouting at the fans, and where Goliath was this bald and mustachioed character who'd come in the ring chewing gum. He was like the silent one. He did talk. It wasn't like Penn and Teller, but he was more like the one who would do minimal talking, where Gordman was just this brash, loudmouth. And they were the kings of playing with foreign objects. In the tag team match, they were like magicians. They would have whatever was supposed to be brass knuckles or whatever. They would pass them to each other, and the referee would go after it, and they'd toss them to the other guy. He'd put it in his mouth. And, the referee would come close to finding the object, but they would outwit him every time. And I often say that the two biggest live events I ever attended, I went to them not knowing I was going to witness history. But one was in 1980 when I saw Ole turn on Dusty in Atlanta, Georgia. And I even remember early when the match was, they were setting up the cage. I remember a fan, that people might recognize, Pete Liedberg, said to people, do you think since they have all these guys in the ring that they'll all turn on Dusty? And most people would deny it, but everybody said, nah, they're not going to do that. Sure enough, they did, but then the other one was 1990, seeing Misawa get, the first big win from Jumbo Tsuruta in Tokyo. And I would
a historical moment as well.
Both of them. Oh my God. It was I was there with Dave Meltzer, and we were like two little kids just wondering, is it going to happen? And when the 3 count happened, we both jumped up like cheering and, just like little kids. I love when a wrestling moment can take you back to that, where, you're just marking out happily and unapologetically. But I would trade both those experiences for the second live match I ever attended. The second match of the night at the Olympic Auditorium was Gordman Goliath versus Tony Rocco, who was a really tough Italian journeyman who is still with us, actually, probably in his 80s, living in Santa Monica.
Okay.
He was a really solid worker, a guy who was usually a mid-carder, but apparently loved to work hard. Like, he loved to work long matches, and he loved getting his cardio in, and also was somebody you didn't mess with a lot. And another guy named La Pantera Negra, who is a really excellent journeyman. Well, Gordman and Goliath were the tag champs, and it was only the second match of the night, but it stole the show. And it was the first time I saw people hurling garbage into the ring.
That's heat, man.
It's heat. And one of the things that were so brilliant was they were dominating the match so well early in the match, and doing their usual tactics and just running roughshod over these, talented baby faces. And then when the baby faces made the comeback, Gordman and Goliath made them look like $1 million+ And even though I had been watching wrestling for 2 years, you like to hold onto your disbelief.
Sure.
You like to pretend that, even though I knew better, saying, "Oh, I know how this match goes," they're still going to win, the Gordman and Goliath. But they were so good at making Rocco and Pantera Negra look like they were just cleaning their clocks. Me and my friends, we were just getting so enthused, just so excited. We actually thought they were getting their butts kicked, because especially Gordman, when he was getting his lunch fed to him, he sold it like the schoolyard bully, where it wasn't even, he didn't even have to take like a move like the pile driver or anything. They hurt his wrist. Like, he's in the corner while Goliath is trying to maintain control, regain control. And he's in the corner holding onto his wrist, like with this look like he's bawling like a child, like, "I'm hurt, my wrist hurts." And, and that's what people want to see. They wanted to see the heels get hurt. And it was just so exciting. But when they went over. I mean, they trashed the two guys. And I was so mad. But I would love to relive that even more than those other two historical moments.
It's not just the match, it's the heat that they generated that really made it sounds like to me.
It was. And, they took me, somebody who knew better, who rationally knew that the heels are going over. But, just like anything in society today, you want to believe something emotional is going to happen rather than something rational. That's right. That's what people, whether it's the working world, politics, religion, people want to believe in something.
Well, you talked about drawing heat, Gordman and Goliath, and everything that was going on there in that particular match that you got to see. What year did you start attending the shows at the arena?
Well, I only got to go once in a while because my dad would take me occasionally, every couple of years, I'm talking. So,
okay.
First match was May 4th, 1973.
Wow.
And I went because Ray Mendoza was appearing, and the grade school I attended, I was in 5th grade at the time. Mm-hmm. All the Latino kids, when I had my Lucha Libre magazines to look through, they would be just fixated on Ray Mendoza. Not El Santo, not Blue Demon, Ray Mendoza. They just said, "That's the guy." And so when he came to town, I'm saying, "Dad, you told me to take me to a match. Can we go to this one?" So it was the night when Ray Mendoza and Raul Reyes won the America's Tag Team titles from Ripper Collins and Gordon Nelson.
Wow, listen to all the names, man. Amazing to see everybody that came through there.
The guys, they had such a diverse parade of wrestlers coming through. It's really great. I wouldn't say LeBell was as good as Paul Bosch in utilizing the Mexican wrestlers. Mm-hmm. Paul Bosch was like the gold standard. I even interviewed Dave Meltzer a few years ago, and he remembers Bosch telling him that the reason he didn't take the Mexican wrestlers for granted, rather than having one or two token Mexican wrestlers to get over the Latino fans. He remembers when he started promoting, and he's drawing a couple of thousand with all this advertising. And then across town, a promoter came in just for one shot and sold out an arena with El Santo. But LeBell did see value in it, in using a lot of the Mexican wrestlers. And Raul Mata was one of the greatest I had ever seen. A journeyman who will, disappear, not so much in Mexican wrestling history, but in American wrestling history. But that guy was such a dynamic worker and such a dynamic babyface, too.
Yeah, he was huge over there in L.A. I'm not really sure what happened with his career because, he came in like a lion and kind of went out like a lamb, so to speak. You see him work in Florida. He wasn't utilized properly there, but at the same time, he just didn't seem to have the same heart either. I don't know if that was just me as a fan in the footage I've seen.
From what I understand, I talked to Tour. I never got to meet him, unfortunately. He passed away about 5 years back. I'm really sorry I never got to meet him, but from what I understand, it was actually a good move in that he fell head over heels with a woman and married her, and he wanted to settle down. So that's why he was enhancement talent.
Well, everything happens for a reason, and if he was happy in real life, then that's okay. I get it. Yeah. Okay, makes sense to me.
And he had a wrestling school for a while. He had a wrestling school, and and in fact, when he passed away, I saw a couple. I can't remember who it was. Can't remember if it was Barry Rose or a few, and one or two wrestlers too, who was saying after his wife passed away, he was still a very nice guy, but just something was taken out of him. So it sounds like he was one of those rare wrestlers who really was crazy about his wife.
Well, that's always good to hear.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com, and to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Rasslin podcast, where we talk the territories, whether it's Jamie Ward with Georgia 81, Roman Gomez with the UWF in 1986, or Gene Jackson covering Memphis in 85. 3 projects going on right now over there at Regional Rasslin. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. Bob goes back in time each and every week, covering not just his career, but countless stories and interactions with hundreds of wrestling names spanning his 2 decades in the business. But that's not all. You can also check out the Puro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Puro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met, from Apple to Spotify, Pocket Cast, and beyond. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Rasslin Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Rasslin Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Rasslin Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Rasslin, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive Watch Along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, Videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia podcast network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
This is Wrestling Nostalgia, the podcast that dives into wrestling history. Hey, wrestling fans, I'm Dave Dynasty, and if you enjoy podcasts that are knowledgeable and history-driven, then Wrestling Nostalgia is for you. With great guests and fun interviews, there are over 200 episodes in our archives. We chat with several first-time guests and often cover topics not discussed on other podcasts. Look up Wrestling Nostalgia on your favorite podcast platform and visit all of our links at linktree/WrestlePod. That is linktr.ee/RASSLEPOD. And remember, wherever you go, whatever you do, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.
You know, I hate to go from something so nice back to the heel side of things here, but you talked about Gordman and Goliath drawing heat. Now I want to talk about another heel from the later days of the territory. The last feud, they say, that kind of prolonged the death of the Los Angeles territory. You probably know where I'm going with this. Talking about Roddy Piper and Chavo Guerrero, the feud that would never end. It went on for, I think, close to 3 years before Roddy finally says, all right, I'm taking off here. But Chavo and Piper, they worked in pretty much every gimmick match that could possibly exist. And then some. They probably worked so many gimmick matches that they redid those matches under different names, I'd have to imagine, at some point. But tell me a little bit about your memories of that Piper-Chavo feud.
Oh, I remember. I feel very honored to have been watching at the time Piper came in, because he came in as a babyface, and they were supposed to use him for just a very short time. And you know, even just as a fan who really didn't understand the business, that's what it looked like. He was coming in here and just getting his butt kicked. I don't think he even got any offense in a lot of the matches. Mm-hmm. And then just one night he comes in there with Java Rook, who was Johnny Rodz doing a madman from the Sudan gimmick. And Piper suddenly is wearing kilts. He didn't wear the kilts before, if I recall correctly. And he had a shirt on that said, "If you can't beat them, join them." Oh. And so Java Rook wrestles this match and destroys Jobber, who in Johnny Rodz, he's destroying a fellow jobber if you were looking at the East Coast. Sure. But after the match, Piper comes and kind of calms him, because his gimmick was he would get disqualified because he didn't know when to stop destroying his opponent. So I remember the interview really well, not word for word, obviously, but just the gist of it was Piper grabs the microphone and just says, "This is the man who taught me the greatest lesson in my life. I've been trying to be a good boy and wrestling by the rules, and this guy came and gave me the beating of my life. And that made me go right out and buy this shirt that says," and he pauses, "Oh, here, I'll read it for you, since the majority of this audience is illiterate. And says, if you can't beat them, join them." And that's where it all started. And Java Rook only hung around for a short time. They were supposed to push him throughout the year, but
didn't he win one of the big battle royals there, Java Rook?
Yeah, he won the 1976 Battle Royal, and Jeff Walton said, like, if you won the Battle Royal, that means they're gonna shape the territory around you for the foreseeable future. The
story I heard in regards to Rodz was he was just homesick. He wanted to go back to New York, go back to Brooklyn.
You hear that a lot. I remember Mickey Doyle telling me when he was with Mike Boyette as the Hippies, the reasons the Hippies never took off is they'd go to a territory and Mike Boyette wanted to go back home. And I don't think that's uncommon. Robert Gibson and his brother Ricky were here in L.A. They were given the tag straps, and boom, with no notice, they just went back home.
Yeah, Jimmy Golden did something similar there in '77 in San Francisco. He was out there for a few weeks, and then he just kind of disappeared. I think the And good old boys just want to go back
nice.
home, man. It's a different world.
I think so. Yeah. I can dig it. I mean, I found places that were more alluring than Southern California, but this is my home.
Well, two guys
I would miss it if I had to be away from it.
Well, I see the two guys here. We're talking Piper and Chavo. They don't go home immediately. They're here for quite a while, working with each other and other talent as well. Was there one particular angle you remember that kind of prolonged this thing, that really gave it the juice, the heat it needed to go on for as long? I know a lot of people are going to say nothing needs to go on for that long, but was there something in there where you were like, wow, and that was kind of like the fire?
Oh, yeah, it was for a while, it was a great feud. And, of course, even when they ran it too long, I mean, they were both just wildly talented, both of them. But my hunch is L.A. wasn't exactly the go-to territory for wrestlers at that time, and so they had these two great workers, and I guess they were trying to milk the feud as long as they could, even when there was no milk left. There's no milk today. And I remember, and again, it was a very campy gimmick, but it went over gangbusters, was they had something called the Jules Strongbow Scientific Trophy in tribute to the longtime booker and former wrestler Jules Strongbow, who had passed away the previous year. And it's funny that they have a scientific trophy for him since he was a brawler back in the day.
You look at that guy and nothing says scientific to me, but yeah, I get you.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Oh, but Chavo was the one who held the title, and the rules were you had to wrestle very clean. It was kind of like old title matches the way it used to be in Mexico. Even if you were a heel, you didn't, up until a few years ago, you didn't rake the eyes and, do all the heel stuff. You wrestled. I even have a friend, Ricky Itaki, who was wrestling as one of Billy Anderson's mercenaries in Tijuana, who in the 80s said a commissioner, scolded him for, doing too much heel stuff in a title match. But, of course, when you translate to American wrestling, it's just, okay, this is the title where you have to wrestle scientifically. You cannot hit with a closed fist. You can't choke. You will immediately be disqualified. And so on TV, Chavo was wrestling Piper. And Piper, the whole story of the match is Piper is just trying to piss off Chavo into hitting him. And when all else fails, when, he goes... when everything he tries just won't get Chavo livid, he just takes a powder of the ring, walks up to Gory Guerrero, who is in a nice suit in the front row. Piper just comes up and just smacks him across the head.
Wow! And
Chavo loses it and hits him, and so he gets disqualified. And now Piper is the scientific trophy winner. And then Chavo did an interview which was so over the top corny, but it worked. It was like, I can't believe I did this. I disgraced the business. And he looks up into the heavens and says, Mr. Strongbow, forgive me. How that got over, I don't know, but it did. It did. Yeah, but they just kept on coming. It was almost like you're watching a weekly Warner Brothers cartoon, with a Wile E. Coyote and Roddy Piper going after Chavo Guerrero with a Roadrunner, and sometimes getting his licks in, but, usually getting his lunch fed to him. And so the feud started early in 76, and I remember by mid-1977, there was a local paper, the Herald Examiner, that would cover the wrestling matches, but they'd do it in a very tongue-in-cheek way. One example is Mickey Doyle, who was a very, very talented journeyman, one of the nicest people you will ever meet in this business, one of the most down-to-earth people. Again, he settled down here because he didn't want to be traveling, so he could, raise his son with some good consistency in a home environment. So he worked a full-time job and just did wrestling on the side. So suddenly he went from a guy who was getting a push to, being jobbed all over the place, to comical proportions that the Herald Examiner would say, rumors are they're going to be selling a Mickey Doyle doll next week at the Olympic. You wind it up, it gets pinned. And so one of their little comical pieces was, hey, it's April, but you don't have to wait this summer to watch all the great reruns. There's a rerun on TV tonight, Chavo Guerrero versus Roddy Piper.
Because they've been working so long.
You can see it all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so even people who weren't that into the business, it was obvious. And Piper stayed here till I think late '78, if I remember.
Yeah, the end
right.
of '78. Yeah, I think he finished up because they had Jeff Walton or someone come on, if I remember correctly, and Walton would announce their final showdown as basically the final confrontation between the two. And I think Piper might have even stuck around just a slightly, a few more weeks after that. I don't know if he was doing jobs on the way out or whatever the specifics were there, but I know that was pretty much the end. You're right. So it's all of '77, basically all of '78, and whenever it started in '76. So like I said, it was close to 3 years. Yeah. And it's amazing they were able to milk it. You don't hear tell of anything going for that long.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe off and on.
And the Guerreros were all great wrestlers. I mean, they just pushed them way too much, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how well they drew at the time. Maybe they were still drawing fairly well, but it definitely wasn't what it was. I mean, you'd see the Guerreros on TV and you knew whether it was Mondo, Chavo, or Hector, if they don't go over us because they were wronged. I mean, it was very predictable, and they just booked it around the Guerrero family too much. And like I said, all three were just phenomenal workers. And another example is they brought in Tank Patton as one of the top heels. I used to write down stuff. And the one thing I will say, he was good on the mic.
Okay.
But they never put him over on TV. The reason I remember this is I used to write down the results when I was watching them back when I was a teenager.
Oh, nice.
I'm saying, this is weird. Like, why? Like, he's always on the microphone, saying what he's going to do, but he hasn't won a match yet. That's the weird thing. He'd win sometimes on a Friday night, but on TV, when you're hyping that Friday night show, he'd get beat.
Well, that is peculiar. Now, I only got to see the tail end of Tank's career, so that's what I'm basing everything, like in Southwest and things of that nature.
He was never a strong worker, and I think he got over in Houston fairly well. He wasn't all that.
Right.
I kind of dug his persona, but yeah, if you're looking for a barn burner or a match, he's not the one you go to.
No. So Roddy Piper wasn't the only guy they brought in to work with Chavo. I don't know if you recall this, but you watch so much wrestling, so I don't know if this sticks out to you, but there was another guy that came in there and worked with Chavo by the name of, you might have heard of him. I think his name was Terry Funk. Come in there, and he cut some interesting promos that might get you canceled today. And but do you remember anything going on between Funk and Guerrero?
Well, remember how I mentioned about Channel 13 being canceled, and they said it was because they were, plugging a show?
Yes.
I do wonder if there was something more to that. We'll never know, but the reason I say that is they did a lot of stuff that for the early 70s even was so xenophobic that I even remember I'd be watching it if my dad was in the room. They'd be doing all these, the heels would be doing these racist monologues, and my dad, to his credit, never said turn that crap off. He would just say, I really find it distasteful when they try to make money like this.
It's crazy too when you think about it, because you're so close to Mexico, right? We're bringing all the guys up here and there. We're bringing in the luchadors and things of that nature. And we have a Spanish speaking program. And of course, the wrestlers would stop off on their way to Hawaii, to Japan and back, so you guys had all these different workers from these different countries versus I can see, how everything worked in the South, but also those guys weren't coming through the South as much. So everything was more unique, and they got away with it for a lot longer versus L.A., which seemed to be a city, just a city, nothing to do with wrestling, a city that was more welcoming, right, than some of the other areas of the United States at that point in time. So that is crazy they're using the cheap heat like that at that point in time in the 1970s.
Exactly, and it probably worked, but that's why I wonder, because I did do some research, and I did find that there were complaints on several regional shows on Channel 13 that, the FCC, complaints about distasteful material, and wrestling was one of them. So I don't know if that really had something to do with it, but I wouldn't be shocked if it wasn't just that one incident that they talk about. So Terry Funk was one of those guys. Oh my God. Funk was brilliant. And the funny thing is he was such a heat machine. He didn't even have to do those racist diatribes on Chavo Guerrero. Mm-hmm. Oh boy. Yeah. He said some, even as somebody who was used to it, I was uncomfortable listening to it.
and that's in the 70s. You know, we heard a little more of that back,
yes.
You know, even in the 80s for me. But yeah, that's I've just read some people online because, you know, I didn't live it, I didn't get to see it, and unfortunately there's no footage out there of it. But I've read some of the people are kind of paraphrasing what they remember some of the promos, how they went, and I'm just like, holy cow, man, how? It's just unbelievable.
Yes. I mean, it did some, you know, when I was 10 years old, I just thought like, oh, that guy's a terrible person for saying that. But it wasn't until a few years later where I was old enough to understand, I don't think they're supposed to be saying this on television. No.
And that was basically the beginnings, really, of the Funk Chavo feud. It was just the comments he was making, no? Or was there an angle in place? Do you remember?
As I recall it, I do know that Chavo would have matches with Dory Funk occasionally. And they would have, like, one of the fun things they did is Chavo Guerrero comes and saying, I have a tape of a call that was made to me from Terry Funk, and I taped it because I had a feeling like he was going to say something out of line. And so it's what they call the person-to-person call. You hear this operator saying, you have a person-to-person call for Chavo Guerrero from Terry Funk. And Terry Funk just goes for 5 minutes just yelling all these slurs at Chavo Guerrero and talks about how you'll never defeat my brother again, and if you do, you will pay for it. You know,
you will pay.
Says if we, oh yeah, you will pay. I can't do Terry Funk justice. No, but God, nobody like him. God, there was nobody like him. Somebody who could make you cry for him if he was a face.
Yes.
I want to kill him if he was a heel.
Yeah,
magnificent.
Oh man, meaner than a hollow-eyed scorpine. But just one of the
greatest.
Yeah,
every now and then I hear somebody making a comparison of another wrestler to Terry Funk, and no, there is no other Terry Funk.
There is not. No, you know, I just watched the Hansen Funk match from All Japan a couple days ago on a video cast I did with Dan Gennity. We were doing for our Patreon, and just his sell job for Hansen beating the crap out of him was just tremendous.
Yeah,
you're sitting there laughing as Funk's selling like he's being choked out, murdered, you know, because of his mannerisms, his facials. It's amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Funk's a tough guy, but he looks like he's being bullied. This tough guy is getting smacked by a bully, and you want to see this guy pay.
Right.
He was just great. I mean, Funk, you know, such a diverse wrestler. I mean, just, I would have loved if he went to Mexico, because I bet you he could have done anything they asked him to. I bet you he would have been doing topes, you know, and all that stuff. He knew how to get over.
Well, before we get into the demise, because we were talking about some peaks here, we were talking about some of the talent here in the 1970s, just a few, and I'm sure a lot of them will pop back up again. But there's one more story I want to get into with you that involves someone you know. We've already kind of mentioned him here earlier on the program, Jerry Graham. And so I got a question for you in regards to Jerry. Hopefully you can relate a story, and then we'll get into kind of where we're going to head into the 1980s, what happened and the decline and all of that, to kind of finish setting the stage for the story we're going to tell as we talk about, you know, the talent and everything on the future episodes of the project. But there's a story, if I remember it correctly, because I do not have it in my notes, but there was a point where Vince, I guess it would have been Senior, wanted to bring Jerry Graham back into the fold in the WF still. And he realized there were some issues still to be had by Jerry, but he's trying to get him set clean and straight. And so he sends him out here. Is this correct so far? To the LeBell territory, along with Ernie Roth, a.k.a. the Grand Wizard, was sent out to be his babysitter, I guess, and act as his manager to kind of make sure he walks that straight and narrow. And I was hoping you could kind of share that with us here.
I remember it well. It was 1975. I believe it was the summer, if I remember correctly, but he just came in one night, and it's so funny because I had seen pictures of him in the magazines, and they had taken him to rehab and got him cleaned up, and he had lost a lot of weight. And when he was on TV, I was like, whoa, I don't even recognize him. He looked so different. And if you look around, you can find some photos of him from that short time he was in L.A. And I remember a number of years later, because Mickey Doyle was working the territory at the time, for a while, Doyle was training me in 84, and Doyle said he remembers that, how Doc was showing up, like, and, you know, towing the line and doing really well, and then he just disappeared, and then he reappeared like a couple of months later. He had just gone somewhere, and it all went to hell.
I see.
And I got more information on that later when about 20 years back, I was at Cauliflower Alley one year and Buddy Roberts was there. And, I actually don't talk. I don't know what to say when I come into a wrestler that whose work I liked. So I usually just, introduce myself, say a few things. But I had told Buddy Roberts that, Mickey Doyle was saying Buddy Roberts is a guy, if you have any talent, you cannot have a bad match with that guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I think Buddy Roberts talked to me a little longer than he normally would have because he said, Mickey Doyle said that? And I said, yeah. And he just paused and said, well, coming from Mickey Doyle, that actually means something. So we talked for quite a while, and we talked about Doc's visit to L.A., and that's also when Humperdinck and the Hollywood Blondes were in the territory.
Right.
And Robert said, I have to be honest, me, Jerry Roberts, and Hump were pretty much to blame for it not working out for Doc because it wasn't Ernie Roth who did the babysitting. LeBell had the Blondes and Humperdinck babysit him. And Robert said, I don't know why he did that because we were taking every drug we possibly could get our hands on. If it was a pill or something to smoke, we did it. He said, so,
Buddy Roberts tried everything under the sun? I don't buy that.
I know. I was shocked. How do you do that and go to Sunday school at the same time? I mean.
So I guess so. Needless to say, Jerry Graham got involved with the wrong influence there in L.A.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure he went on some good psychedelic trips, and but as far as
never came back.
Career, never came back to L.A. No,
I meant mentally.
Even
never
if
came
the
back,
blonde,
but that too.
yeah, exactly. No, he. If it wasn't the blonde, something would have happened. He was a guy who could walk a straight line for a while, and then, the party atmosphere was a lot more appealing to him than the working atmosphere.
Understood. Okay. No, I'd heard that story before, and I at least when I heard it, I heard that the Grand Wizard was sent out there initially, but he comes back to New York and leaves Jerry out there because he seemed to be doing okay. And obviously that wasn't the case, at least not for long, as you say.
Yeah.
So he held up for a little bit, but the Temptations gave in. So I figured if anybody knew the story, you had to have heard it at least at the very least. So I'm glad you shared that here with us. So we go on, and they lose their TV in the mid-'70s. For what reason, we're not 100% sure. We have our ideas as to what may or may not have happened alongside the reasons given. But they keep, you say they pick up a UHF station, and I don't know how long that lasts them, but they keep the Spanish-speaking station for the duration. Do they not, into 1982?
Yeah. The Spanish station was there until the very end, and I think it was only the last 2 years where they didn't have Miguel Alonso narrating the matches. And I don't think at some point Jimmy Lennon bowed out. And, in general, you could just tell they would be pushing people who, there was a tag team called the Valenzuela Brothers who, they were trained locally, not bad guys, but they were very green, and they weren't the most phenomenal workers, but they put the tag straps on them. It's like they were, just trying to squeeze blood from a tournament.
Man,
and people who would have drawn a few years earlier, like Ox Baker.
Right.
In 1980, he wasn't quite the same Ox he was.
Definitely.
There's a lot of people who, and Pompero Firpo, who I loved, but in 1980, Pompero Firpo, I'm sure he was ready to retire, and he didn't, kind of like how Bull Curry stayed around for a long time and wasn't quite the terrifying figure he used to be.
No, yeah, it's funny, Pampero Firpo and Bull Curry were guys that my dad told me about, so imagining him, and I knew they worked into the 1980, and I knew Pampero Firpo did, the footage is out there, but you're right, I mean, obviously past their primes, and they're still trying to go, and they were still over to a degree, especially Firpo, but I don't know that he was selling the arena out by that point, the Olympic. And they tried their best with what they had, and that during that period, there's going to be a lot of names we encounter, and hopefully there's some stories you can share and, as we go along, and we discuss 1980 through 1982. I'm still looking at the monster here on my list. Can't wait to get to that. But I mean, so many guys come through there that'll be something someday. Tom Pritchard, Chris Adams. I mean, there's a lot of guys that are going to be breakout stars, you know, moving forward.
Both of them, that was their first big territories, both Tom Pritchard and Chris Adams. That was their first full-time U.S. push.
But, you know, Peter Maivia is going to come back through there in the early 80s before you know, he passes. And there's just Victor Rivera, again, past his prime, but he comes back there to work. John Toles. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The Golden Greek. So there's so many names, and Chavo will even pop back through there. Ron Starr is going to have some runs. So there's a lot to get into in regards to all of that. But my question to you is, was there a specific point where you felt the decline as a fan? Was it when the announcers started leaving? Was it when they lost the TV way back in the mid-70s? What was it for you where you realized there was a severe decline? Not just, oh, this isn't what it used to be, but now the talent is maybe lesser to a degree from top to bottom. Was there a year or a moment where you think you can recall?
I mean, just my own anecdotal feeling of a lack of enthusiasm was, I think, the year 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like I said, was when they just milked the Chavo and Piper feud too long. And that was when they debuted the gimmick where Lars Anderson was a bionic wrestler who had a magic arm. There was a doctor at ringside with... Yeah, there's a doctor with a computer at ringside.
Wow, that's some pre-York Foundation stuff right there. Doctor.
Oh, yeah, it was... Yeah. I think his name was like Dr. Manfred Wilson or something like that. And he had this computer, and it wasn't even done well. Like, all the match would be was Lars Anderson putting an arm lock on somebody, and the person selling the arm lock like they were in dire pain. And they wouldn't even have to be like a 1-minute match to make it look like this bionic arm was dangerous. You know, it'd go on forever.
You go from being one of the world-famed, well, at least Crockett-famed Anderson brothers, so Georgia and Crockett and things of that nature, one of the original Andersons. And, of course, you know, Ole would come in there. And now you're over here by 1977 working a bionic arm gimmick, which apparently is controlled by
Jeff Walton. Yeah, by a doctor at ringside, a scientist. Jeff Walton told me that that was Lars Anderson's idea.
Wow. Well, he'd been saving that for a few years, I guess, kept it in his back pocket for a rainy day. Glad he wasn't booking in the 1980s. I don't know why
Ole Anderson didn't go for that.
Yeah. Could you imagine how many times did he try to pitch that to Ole, do you think? And he told him, well, that's stupid, you son of a bitch. So...
But you tell me I'm stupid all the time, Ole. Why should I listen to you?
Yeah, what's any different with this angle than anything else I've come up with for you? So, exactly. No, so Jeff Walton, now there's a name we haven't even mentioned yet, really, and that's a name that's very prominent in the Los Angeles territory. Mm-hmm. Tell everybody a little bit about Jeff, his background with the territory.
Well, he was one of those fellows who grew up a fan. I mean, he grew up alongside, who was it, Johnny Legend. People might know as the promoter of Incredibly Strange Wrestling and the rockabilly singer, and the person who wrote Pencil Neck Geek. They, pals around at the arena as they were growing up. And, Walton got into the business as a fan and was very close with Freddie Blassie, as was Johnny Legend. And I think it was Blassie who landed Walton the gig.
Oh, okay.
And so when I was growing up watching wrestling, Jeff Walton be one of the guys who would, be pitching the upcoming Friday night shows. He's one of the personalities. And, the more people like Dick Lane would bow out and stuff like that, the more time Jeff Walton would get on TV. He became more of a prominent figure. And very nice guy. I mean, something to say about him was when I was like a teenage fan doing a newsletter, Tom Burke told me to send him a copy of your newsletter, and I did, and he actually wrote me back and said, hey, I booked San Bernardino. I'd love for you to come out sometime and see the matches. And he'd get me interviews when I was starting to write for the Ring Wrestling magazine. He's somebody who just grew up with a love for the business. And I think one of the people who kind of got him involved was a fellow named Art Williams, who is a name people won't recognize, but he's a real unsung hero. He's somebody who worked for their LeBell promotion, I think, until the very end, if I remember right. And I think he did a lot of booking for some of the wrestlers for Japan, or people who were stopping over in L.A. from Japan, like Bruno and Kowalski. Now, Walton is one of those guys who was in the business and was, every bit a super fan as he was somebody who believed in the business.
Yeah, Jeff was a jack of all trades. I don't know if he envisioned himself being such a jack of all trades when he broke in, but he was really doing it. He was doing the interviews at times. He was doing the commentary at times. He would wind up doing magazines and things of that nature. He even had a very brief cup of coffee trying to work with the WWF there during the inception of the national expansion. He would go on to become a manager. We're covering him right now on another project here on Regional Rasslin, 1985 Memphis and Tux Newman. So, and managing the Macho Man Randy Savage right before he leaves to the WWF. So, yeah, Jeff Walton was around. He had done a lot of things, and he found his way into the business. And his son is actually, I don't know if he wants me to tell everybody this, so I'll leave his name out there, but his name out of this. But his son's actually on Facebook, and he'll contact me every time I post something involving the Tux Newman character, just saying, thank you for posting this. And so, he's out. Shout out to him if he's listening. Guy. Yes. And so, hopefully,
his son is an awesome cat.
I said, hopefully he'll listen to this eventually and kind of hear some of the stories we tell about Jeff along the way, as I've got some information to talk about it in regards to, the tail end of the territory that we're going to be getting to, beginning with the next episode. And this was really just to kind of getting to know you, Vandal. So that's what I wanted to do for
know all about you.
Oh, you're an opera singer too. I love it. So, but
I'd help the world if I am.
Yeah, so we go from L.A. to Portland to Titanes and Argentina. I mean, All Japan Women or whatever, and all these things that you got to watch growing up, basically in the 1970s, being lucky enough to be out there on the West Coast in Los Angeles where everything was popping.
I forgot to mention that my mom landed a job up in Sacramento, which is, it's practically another state.
Yeah.
Opposed to Southern California. So I got to see the Roy Shire territory when I would go out to visit her.
Yeah, Hank Renner.
So I got a little bit of everything. I was a lucky cat.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Hank Renner and crew up there in San Francisco. So you got to see a little bit of every territory over there on the West Coast at some point. And so we talked about the peaks, and we talked about there was even valleys before the 1980s. Of course, the peaks being, Piper and Chavo when it was hot, Terry Funk coming in, Gordman and Goliath, and so many other talents throughout that time period that you were watching it. And, of course, the valleys like the Bionic Wrestler, Lars Anderson, with, Dr. Professor Manfred Crystal, maybe? Or something.
I think it was Manfred Wilson. I might be remembering incorrectly, but that's what I remember the name being.
Okay. Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's been a long time since I did some digging into that. And that really brought back memories because that's something I haven't researched in eons. So when you said that, I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. But it paved the way. Lars Anderson, the Bionic Wrestler, he walked so that the monster could run, or at least attempt to run, as we get into the 1980s here. So looking forward to covering that, as I mentioned it the third time now in this episode. But just one of the reasons there was a demise here in the early 80s, I'd have to think. Andre the Giant wasn't having any of it. Can't wait to get to that story.
Oh, yes. Yes. I had the honor of being there the night they debuted the monster. And
really?
In the summer of 81, and they debuted him in San Bernardino. And we had been told that, there was going to be a Frankenstein monster wrestling. And so we had heard it from somebody who was, working in the office. They're going to have Hot Stuff Hernandez, dressed up as Frankenstein, essentially. So me and my friend Lloyd, we had to go to the arena that night. And
I got to see this.
I remember. Oh, yeah. And I remember it's the last match of the evening, and Salvador Bellomo was in the ring, all ready to go. And Jeff Walton walks down the aisle, and San Bernardino Arena was a place that seated like 1,500. It was one of those wonderful matchbox arenas that I love so much. Mm-hmm. But Walton walks down the aisle and takes the microphone and says, fans, I don't know what I just saw, but I just want all of you to clear the aisles, and whatever this thing that walks down the aisle is, don't get near it, please, I implore. And people are already laughing, what the hell? And so Goliath comes out dragging the monster in chains, and the people immediately are just laughing and booing it, and they all thought it was Enforcer Luciano under their masks, so they're screaming, "Take the mask off, Enforcer!" And I think the reason they had Goliath there is because Hernandez was a pretty green wrestler, and I think Goliath was kind of like there to kind of carry him through the matches.
Oh,
and
that makes sense.
Yeah, he was a monster who would no-sell all these moves and would go over, and they claimed he was built in a laboratory by the nefarious Pete Collins, a heel manager who... And, spare no expense in the gimmicks. The way they eventually turned the monster babyface, and the way they did that is Tom Ernesto, the booker, had a little flashlight pen that he would turn on and off to hypnotize the monster and make him do good things.
Okay. Looking forward to this entire story when it comes out. So, that you guys see why we're in the decline now, moving into the 1980s, because for every Adrian Street... For every Adrian Street,
that was a bright spot.
That was a bright spot, but as you said, there were also the the Valenzuela brothers. What was it, Mario and Joel, or something like that?
Yeah,
it's a hodgepodge of talent we're going to be covering.
Yeah,
here.
There's a lot of stuff to talk about. So we'll have no shortage of subjects.
No, definitely not.
Both, like you said, both the peaks and valleys. Because even in that final year, there would be some shows that drew pretty well, especially when they brought in guys from Mexico. I think there were 2 or 3 super shows where there was one where they had a match between the Death Missionaries against the Villanos. That was a 6-man bloodbath. I remember seeing it live, and I know it was taped for TV, so I'm hoping those tapes are out there. So there are these little glimpses of brilliance, but then they'd give way to just something really lame.
Right. So for every, let's say, for every Brazos, the Los Brazos, they come in, for every time we see something like that, we also have, as you pointed out, Enforcer Luciano also lurking around the corner.
Yeah.
So, or Battleship Johnson, things of that nature. So.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yeah.
So we'll be talking about all those names and so much more. Stay tuned, guys. Man, I appreciate it, Vandal. Kurt, I appreciate you doing the first episode. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And remember, this was just kind of a getting to know you episode, setting the stage. We're not even into the 1980s. That's where we start next time around as we get rolling into this story we're telling.
Yeah. This is a fun trip down memory lane. Make lemonade out of them lemons. Look back on the territory. It was the demise of a territory, but it was actually kind of fun watching it.
It's like watching a house burn down. You can't look away. Yeah, it's like it's not the greatest thing in the world to happen to someone, but I just can't help but watch, right?
Yeah, and there were some times where you're just doubled over laughing at something that went over so terribly or was such a bad gimmick. I mean, there was actually an enjoyment, especially if Mike LeBell made an appearance on the microphone. He should never be allowed to have a microphone in his hand, but it could be very amusing.
Well, man, we've got so much to talk about. Looking forward to it as we jump into the 1980s next time around, guys. Once again, Vandal, I want to thank you so much for being here on Regional Rasslin. Can't wait to do this again very soon, sir.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for zeroing in on the L.A. territory because, I think it should get a little more attention in the history books.